With the last session. Welcome everyone to this roundtable on lessons and legacies of Gerda Lerner's life and work for the 21st century. I think we addressed this topic, lessons and legacies, throughout the whole day, but now we have 1 hour, the next hour, to explicitly discuss this point. I think we learned throughout the whole day that Gerda Lerner is a figure in whom politics, scholarship, activism is inseparably intertwined. We learned not only about influential books, but also how she helped to build institutions, especially in women's history, creating programs, curricula, archives that make new historical perspectives durable. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be here yesterday because we had a workshop of our doctoral program in gender studies here in Graz. So apologies if I raise questions that already have been addressed yesterday. But from today's discussion, I took with me some, for me, important aspects. These were transnational perspectives. We heard much about how it is possible to translate her work into very different national contexts, Austrian, European, US contexts, South Asian contexts, but also to translate her work into different topics and historical periods. So how we can use her work to address epistemic injustice, epistemic violence of archives, sexual exploitation, in general, power relations, but also where it is necessary to rethink her approaches or to translate them into current concepts. And one point for me is why it could be important to think about gender as an integrative category of social and cultural historical analysis, adopting intersectional approaches, and at the same time, nevertheless, keep women as subjects in history visible, however we categorize this term. So this topic of women's and gender history, I think, will be one key thread throughout our conversation. Especially what we can learn from Lerner's way of founding and defending this field of research as a discipline, women's history. But I think we also want to go beyond that point and ask, how did Lerner connect scholarship and political activism? And what does this mean for us today? What can we learn from her about the institutionalization of approaches dealing with inequality, with marginalized voices in history, how we can integrate them into research contexts, into universities, especially when these approaches are under pressure, financial pressure, social pressure, political pressure, as we see in Austria, but of course also in the US context. So what lessons, what impulses does her work offer for the further development of history and for the development of critical scholarship? So I think we saw today how we can use Lerner's life and work as a starting point to think about these broader questions. Also connecting women's gender history with Jewish history, but also about thinking about the relationship between the academic and the political commitments today. So let me briefly introduce our participants. It's a great pleasure to introduce Bettina Abtecker. I think she's with us. Yes, can you hear us?
I can, yes.
Yeah. Very well. Who is joining us online from Santa Cruz? Bettina is Distinguished Professor Emerita of Feminist Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and a longtime scholar activist. She co-led the free speech movement at UC Berkeley, was active in the movement to end the war in Vietnam, and helped lead the campaign to free Angela Davis. At UC Santa Cruz, she helped build one of the leading feminist studies departments, which has reached and taught influential courses such as Introduction to Feminisms, which has reached a global audience online. Her books range from The Morning Breaks, The Trial of Angela Davis, and Tapestries of Life, to her memoir Intimate Politics, and her recent book Communists in Closets, Queering the History in 1930s to 1990s. Those, thank you very much for being with us. Next, I'm happy to introduce Catherine Turk. I already saw her online, who is joining us online from Chapel Hill. Catherine is Professor of History and Adjunct Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. She's a historian of women, gender, and sexuality, law, labor, and social movements in the 20th century United States. Her first book, Equality on Trial, Gender and Rights in the Modern America Workplace, won major prizes in US women's and gender history. And her recent book, The Women of Now, How Feminists Built an Organization that Transformed America, was named one of the best books in 2023 by The New Yorker. Her work helps us to see how the gains that Lerner's generation fought for have been institutionalized, contested, and sometimes rolled back, and what this means for women's and gender history today. Here on site, I'm very pleased to welcome Gabriela Hauch. Gabriela is Professor Emerita of Modern History with a specialization on women's and gender history at the University of Vienna. And she's one of the key figures in building women's and gender history in Austria and beyond. She has founded and co-led important institutional structures for this field, including the Interdisciplinary Institute for Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Linz, and she co-led the research focus on women's and gender history at the University of Vienna. So her work ranges from women's lives and revolutions in the 19th century to questions of gender and Jewish history. And she also has been recognized with several major awards for her contributions to this topic. Also here on site, I'm delighted to welcome Malachi H. Hakohen. Malachi is Bass Fellow and Professor of History, Religion, Jewish Studies, and German Studies at Duke University, and currently EFK Fellow in Vienna. His work focuses on Central European intellectual and Jewish history, social theory, and political philosophy, with a particular interest in exile, migration, and the transformations of European and Jewish thought in the 20th century. He has written influential books on Karl Popper and Jewish European history between nation and empire. Has also held many fellowships and at leading research institutes in Europe and the United States. And finally, I'm happy to introduce Katharina Scharf. Katharina is a postdoc researcher and lecturer in the Working Group for Cultural and Gender History at the University of Graz, a position she held since 2021. She works on women's and gender history, environmental history and nature conservation movements, tourism history, and National Socialism in Austria. 2021, she published two monographs, one on women in Salzburg during National Socialism, and the second on tourism history of Salzburg and Savoy, also an introduction into regional history, 2023. She has held several fellowships, such as the Rachel Carson Simon Weil Fellowship at the LMU in Munich, and here she represents a kind of younger generation of historians and will bring a perspective from an early career researcher in gender history. So thank you to all of you for accepting the invitation. So we agreed that we will hear first 3 statements, 5-minute statements from Bettina, Catherine, and Gabriella, and then bring Malachi and Katharina into our discussion. So I would like to invite you, Bettina, to start with your statement. From your perspective and your experience as an activist, but also as a scholar. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this. And I know it's afternoon there, and it's early morning here. So, and I'm waking up. So I have a few memories and reflections that I put together. I first encountered Gerda Lerner when I was about 11 years old. It was 1955, at the height of the McCarthy anti-communist mania in the United States, which had been raging for almost a decade. My mother came home from work one day with a book called No Farewell. It was a novel published by a small left press called Associated Authors, closely allied with the US Communist Party. The author of the novel was Gerda Lerner. Jewish and/or communist refugees from Hitler Europe were frequent visitors to my parents' home, and I was steeped in stories about the Holocaust and the resistance. I read this novel, I can still see its gray and white cover, and was deeply affected by it. so much so that I can still recall one or two scenes from it after 70 years. The novel was largely autobiographical. It was set in Vienna in Gerda's adolescence and young adulthood after the Anschluss on March 12th, 1938. Among the many writers and artists who visited my parents' home, I don't think Gerda or her beloved husband Karl were ever there, but I held her in fascinated esteem for many years after that childhood experience. I had been deeply involved in the movement to free Angela Davis in the early 1970s. After her acquittal, I entered graduate school. I focused my studies on African American women's history in large part because of my experiences in defense of Angela and how much I learned from her and about Black women. I was especially influenced by the 1971 essay she wrote, The Black Woman's Role in the Community of Slaves, written in prison, and which in many ways helped to inaugurate the field of Black women's history. Of course, I soon found Gerda's documentary history, Black Women in White America, published in 1972, the same year Angela was acquitted. It was such a revelation to this budding feminist. I used it extensively while writing my master's thesis and when I began teaching in the mid 1970s and onward. I finally met Gerda Lerner in June 1981 at the Berkshire Conference on Women's History at Vassar. At first, she seemed reluctant and almost afraid to talk with me, my last name perhaps too close to the communist circles that had resulted in so much persecution. But then she came up to me and apologized and brought me outside with her. We sat together on a stone parapet and had what I remember as a wonderful talk about family, my studies, her work, and generously offered to blurb my forthcoming book, Woman's Legacy, Essays on Race, Sex, and Class in American History. Gerda's scholarship reflected her, her archival and historical training, her Marxist leanings, and her anti-fascist politics. In this regard, I think it is important to know about the formation, and it's already been discussed here at the conference, of the Congress of American Women in 1946. It began as a kind of continuation of an anti-fascist popular front among women. Gerda was not only a member, but helped to build it. Two pioneering women's historians, Eleanor Flexner and Alma Lutz, were also part of that Congress. Flexner was its first president from 46 to 48. The works of Flexner and Lutz preceded Gerda's and would have influenced her, I think. In both cases, as in Gerda's work, women's history was always intertwined with race and class. For example, Flexner's intersectional epic study of the American women's suffrage movement, Century of Struggle, was published by Harvard in 1959. It provided a counterpoint to an established male-dominated profession that saw the movement as a footnote to history at best. It also was very important in the early days of the women's liberation movement. Flexner was both a communist and, for many people who don't know it, was in a Boston marriage with another woman for 30 years. She was in the party for 20. She also taught the first ever course on women's history at the communist-run Jefferson School in 1953. Gerda's Marxist leanings are evident throughout her career, and most especially in her later efforts when she wrote The Creation of Patriarchy in 1986, followed by a second volume on the creation of feminist consciousness in 1993. She wrote, for example, on patriarchy, quote, "The period of the establishment of patriarchy was not one event, but a process developed over a period of approximately 2,500 years, from 3,100 to 600 BC. It occurred within the Near East at a different pace and at different times in several distinct societies." And she continued, "The appropriation by men of women's sexual and reproductive capacity occurred prior to the formation of private property and class society. Its commodification lies, in fact, at the foundation of private property. That ownership of women by men preceded the formation of private property and class society is an earth-shattering conclusion about the centrality of patriarchal social relations to the very foundations of ancient pre-modern and modern societies, and, in my view, turns Marxism on its head, so to speak. It is a conclusion not widely known or acknowledged, and its implications are very important. And you can really see it now in politics in the United States and the way it's intertwined with the patriarchal and fascist or proto-fascist movements. It's so intertwined with that and white supremacy. You can just feel the pulse of it. But Gerda had imagined this as a 7-volume work, but she gave up the project because she was so roundly criticized in multiple reviews for sweeping assertions over vast historical periods in vastly different places and cultures. At least that's what she said to me. Perhaps part of the problem here was that reviewers read this as historical claim rather than a materialist historical treatise, which is, I think, what she was after. It was a very ambitious project. The last time I saw Gerda was in Santa Cruz, a couple of years after the publication of her autobiography, Fireweed. I invited her on behalf of the Feminist Studies Department to talk about the book. I remember a disappointingly modest turnout, a vigorous talk, a robust Q&A, a cordial dinner with some students. She was in her 80s then, still physically well, her mind agile, her voice confident, peppered at times with acerbic observations, as I'm sure everybody is quite aware of her capacity for, and about the political, the personal, and the historical. And I also discovered by time with her that she reminded me a lot of my mother in certain ways because she was very impatient. She got very impatient about things and annoyed at various things that happened, like going into a CVS and trying to buy something and couldn't find it, and then came storming out, got back in the car, was sort of yelling about it. And well, anyway, we spent a considerable amount of time together. And in those couple of days, I felt a growing intimacy between us and my deep, deep personal affection for her. So much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bettina, also for sharing your personal and biographical memories with us. I would like directly go to Catherine. Could you go next?
Yes, my pleasure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, it's okay.
Oh, wonderful. Good. Well, thank you so much to my fellow panelists and to Hydron for that lovely introduction, and of course to Vera for organizing this terrific conference. Hearing the biographies and the lists of works written by my fellow panelists, we can see how expansive Lerner's reach has been. And of course, it's high time to revisit her work and to think about all the different ways it has influenced scholarship over these past decades. Unlike Bettina, I never had the opportunity to meet Gerda Lerner, although I've been trained and deeply influenced by the work of those who worked with her, Nancy McLean and Linda Gordon, chief among them, but certainly many, many others. So why am I here? I'm here because with my colleague, Leandra Zarno of the University of Houston, I've been working on a long-term project that seeks to retell the long arc of U.S. women's history through Lerner's life and her work. And so I come to this topic of Lerner from the perspective of U.S. women's history and how that field has changed over its past half century. So, Leandra and I are interested in how, in studying history in an academic setting, really for the first time, Lerner noticed gaps in and attention to an understanding of women in and outside the academy because she had experience in what she called living a split life, a concept that she articulated in an essay called Living in Translation, which was published in her 1997 book, Why History Matters, Life and Thought. And Leandra and I have found this concept of a split life, the inherent dualities in learners' experience. We found this idea to be especially fruitful. And we think that with learners' life as a through line, we can gain new perspective on the changes in the field of women's history in all its iterations, its shortcomings, its possibilities, its potential to continue to reshape both the academy and the rest of life, both in America and beyond. Leandra and I are really interested in how, for Lerner, women's history was already essential. It was a lens for making sense of herself, no less than making sense of her adopted homeland of the United States, as well as other parts of the world, other places and time. Lerner drew on her own past to help women discover and document their presence in history. And she saw women's history as a political project as much as an academic one. She brought definition and historical study to the idea of patriarchy and practiced an understanding of the interplay between race, class, and sex, now described as intersectionality. She also used women's history as a lens to evaluate US society writ large. Because patriarchy was a little employed form of analysis in the 1960s and 70s, as my fellow panelist Bettina, I think was mentioned earlier, she believed that it could be both an instrument for social change and a means to deliver an irreversible intellectual paradigm shift. And we think that both have proven to be true. We also think, and this gets to the theme of our panel of sort of looking at the present and looking ahead, that Lerner's concept of living a split life captures the current state of women's history, at least in the United States, an accepted subfield that remains stuck on the margins. We've seen how women's history has taken a catch-all approach that seeks to incorporate many, many perspectives, which of course is very important. The field has recently been described in a review essay as a big tent, but we're also interested in recovering what might bind it together and how we might sort of get our arms around this big tent and use it to drive learners' historical and political projects forward into the future. The field has grown, but it has not always sought to engage broader historical narratives or to press the case for gender as an essential category of analysis. Lerner observed this trend as it germinated, a generational shift from interest in women's political and social history and toward more cultural issues related to identity. And we think the field has to do both. We see Lerner's vision for the field as articulated in her essay of 1975, Placing Women in History, Definitions and Challenges, as a useful guidepost. And it's an article that I teach almost every semester, where she is sort of, she's helped to give rise to this field, and she's really thinking through what are the right lenses, what is the right approach, how can we possibly capture women as a group in all their diversity and make the case for women's history. And from this perspective, we can more easily push back against narratives of progress. In that essay, Lerner framed women's history as a temporary necessity, a necessary approach to understanding the past, but she hoped and even expected that it would be temporary, that by restoring women to their proper place in the record, eventually all history would be men's and women's history, that women's voices and perspectives would become an integral part of every history written about any place, any time. Once all practitioners of history understood the importance and centrality of women as what Mary Beard called a force in history, they could finally write fully integrated histories, and the field would continue on from there. But of course, that's not what we have seen. Lerner did predict women's historians' current struggle to generalize about the field beyond affirming its expansiveness, right? The puzzle is that women are such a huge and diverse group, and yet we need to talk about them as a group sometimes at points they imagine themselves as a group, and to assert that their presence in history has mattered. We think that Lerner's split life concept illuminates how, here in the first, moving into the second quarter of the 21st century, we see that women are further integrated into public life, places of education, business, popular culture, and government, while still facing barriers to equal wealth and power, alongside a systemic legal rollback, at least in the US context, of personal freedoms. Women are, in a sense, still living a split life, that women's history focused equally on their subjectivities and the structures that they live among can help them understand. Women's historians, we see, at least in the US concept or context, living a split life in the academy that demands a continual reassertion of the field's presence and importance. And we think that Lerner's body of work can help us to do that. Looking around in my decade plus as a US women's historian, I see retrenchment and even steps backward, dried up funding streams, fewer full-time positions, survey texts of US history that pay little attention to women's history or sort of sideline it as some separate thing. Even a widespread sense by some in the field of US history that there's nothing new to say about women, that women's history is passé, it's been done. We don't need to pay attention to their diverse perspectives anymore. To use a baseball metaphor, a popular sport here in the States, women's history is still on first base, still doing Lerner's earliest work of making the case that women have always shaped history at every place, every time, and will continue to do so. That, in fact, to borrow the title of Lerner's 1987 bibliography, where she sought to take stock of all of the existing works of women's history, that, in fact, quote, women are history. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Catherine, also for pointing towards these two aspects, women history as instrument for social change, but also as a paradigm shift within historical research. So we turn to you, Gabriela.
Yeah, dear all, I met Gerda Lerner in 1984 at the International Conference of Women Historians in Vienna. It was great. Now we had in Austria and throughout the German-speaking world a kind of grandmother figure who had been engaged in women's history for a long, long time. There were hardly any female professors and only few female university lectures there. And there was this native-born Austrian who had shown us what we all might have been possible had the two dictatorships, Austrofascism and National Socialism, not persecuted, expelled, and murdered a large portion of the intelligentsia, especially Jewish people, as Gerda was. The fact that Gerda Lerner was in Vienna back in 1984 was wonderful for her and for us as well. She encouraged me and everyone else back then to preserve, to continue researching with gender-sensitive questions. And she encouraged us not only to claim our scopes for action, but to expand it, to be courageous in life and in academia. That is likely, I think, the fundamental lesson and Gerda Lerner's legacy for the 21st century. Dear all, we are living in a phase of tremendous socio-political transformation. This is unsettling and currently inspires more fear than hope. It has given rise to what appears to be a contradiction. Global disembedding is accompanied by intensification of nationalism, ethnocentrism, religious fundamentalism, and also identity politics. This is based on the categorization of people into us and them. As a Jewish woman, Gerda Lerner experienced this division firsthand during the Nazi era. And in her research, which from the outset focused on the triad of race, class, and gender and more, she fought against it. The aim was to highlight those constructed as the other and to bring their experiences of discrimination to light, whether women, people of color, those from lower social classes, or people who identify as queer. But she also saw it as her duty to get involved in socio-political debates and to take a stand with a view to achieving comprehensive emancipation. I think that is necessary worldwide today. Such parallels have also existed in other historical periods of transformation, for example, during the wave of globalization around 1900. However, there is a fundamental difference to be noted here. About 120 years ago, under the banner of socialism and communism, and perhaps also anarchism, there were major socio-political ideologies committed to universal justice. They lost their appeal due to Stalinist perversion, and I think such a global idea is missing today. Perhaps for Gerda it would have been now feminism. And this brings me to another legacy of Gerda. She was a historian of long history, we heard it before. And she did not shy away from the grand international perspective. This had not got unchallenged. But I think that in our world and in our academia, including the history of women and gender, which have become so vast and complex, it's good not to lose sight of this long and comprehensive view. And now, moving from the big picture to something a little smaller that I personally associate with Gerda Lerner. Once, Walter Benjamin wrote, "If you want to fight against the harshness of the world, never miss an opportunity to be kind." Gerda Lerner once saved me at a very important moment in my life. It was the International Conference of Women Historians in 1984, which I've already mentioned. I was still a student and gave a presentation there on my thesis about women in the Viennese Revolution of 1848. And I was heavily criticized there by an older colleague, whom I know. I understood virtually nothing of the criticism. Suddenly, an older lady in an elegant suit stood up and delivered a passionate speech in my defense. That was Gerda Lerner. And although of her straight but nice authoritarian manner, she called for a more supportive and empathetic approach among us. I've remembered that my whole life. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gabriela, for opening up the Austrian context in this founding phase of women's and gender history, but also pointing towards this plea for looking at current struggles, current political challenges, and also thinking about attitudes. So, Malachi, we start with you next.
Okay, thank you. So this is actually my first opportunity to thank first the Center for Jewish Studies and the director, Professor Lamprecht, and Vera for organizing this conference and for inviting me. This is a very interesting and innovative project. I remember that when I saw it first ever as project, I thought that it was absolutely brilliant. That is thinking of Gerda Lerner as a transatlantic intellectual, as a Jewish immigrant, a transatlantic intellectual and a founder, someone who connects women history across the ocean. And that is absolutely brilliant. And we see the results in this conference. Women, the communities of Gerda Lerners across the globe, working across the globe, and attempting to establish communication and conversation, which is not always easy, but which is necessary all the more. And my response to the presentations and to the conference will be first a short recount of my own personal encounter with Gerda Lerner, and then some responses to the issues raised in the conference. So I knew Gerda Lerner in the very final course of her career when she came to Duke University already as a professor emeritus at Wisconsin. And I believe she was there as visiting professor between 1997 and 2002. And I heard she was coming to Duke. And I was a little afraid, to be frank, to meet her first, because I was an intellectual historian, a European intellectual historian, and I was Israeli. And for me, that is, I came from Israel, and she was known to be a formidable figure, and what she would think of me. And then, I mean, she was walking down the corridor, and she was smiling at me, and I mean, we must be, and she was full of smile. So disarming and so personal. I mean, it was quite wonderful to meet her. And then she showed up in a seminar on Vienna. And she was clearly very taken by the seminar. And at the end of the seminar, which was on philosopher Karl Popper, she said, "This was my Vienna. I mean, it was right this way in my house. I mean, the Christmas tree and the Star of David." No. Truth is, it was not her Vienna, because, I mean, Karl Popper was an assimilated Jew. That is, he was a Protestant, and her house was still a Jewish house. And this morning, actually, you clarified to me that it was even more Jewish than I thought, because you mentioned that they did go to synagogue, right? I did not realize that. Okay, so of course in Karl Popper's house, no one went to synagogue, no one went to church either. They were Protestants in Catholic Vienna, right? Which means they did not want to see any church, right? It was prima facie, they converted because they needed to get out of the Jewish community. So it was not quite, but I mean, this was the encounter of the cultural life of in between the German community and the Jewish community of the secular Jews of Vienna. And this was a very emotional response. The second occasion on which we were again saw each other on various occasions, but the second occasion on which I remember very clearly, which will remain always with me, is after my tenure. When I was invited to give a lecture, she was sitting there with the oldest faculty in the history department, already almost emeritus. His name, an old Marxist. His name was Warren Lerner, my favorite, my closest friend in the department. He was a scholar of Karl Radek, another Marxist, leading Marxist who was executed by Stalin in 1940, the two were sitting together, chatting and smiling, almost a Jewish couple. If Warren Lerner probably had the personality of her former husband, and they were looking at me and smiling at me, sort of. The Jewish boy did well. This was probably not. I'm not sure this was it was possibly a different Gerda Lerner from the one that is familiar to for most other contexts. And this is the picture. This is the picture. This was April 2001, and that's the way I like to remember the world. 4 months later, it was was 9/11, and after that began. The world began closing down with the Bush censorship and the various security measures, which led to the world in which we are facing nowadays. That's as far as my memories of the good old world and the good old times, which are connected with Gerda Lerner at Duke. Now, to some of the issues that were raised here in the conference, which are also connected to Gerda Lerner at Duke. We've been debating some of the issues that were related to, to the women history versus the more recent developments in the move from women history to between women and gender, and the issues relating to intersectionality, the soft version of intersectionality versus the hard version of intersectionality. And we could see how how there are different Gerda Lerners emerging in different communities. For example, the Indian group, wherever the history of patriarchalism still is still central, such as, for example, in the Indian example, the old Gerda Lerners makes actually most sense, and when intersectionality is used, it's used in its softer version, while the maintenance of the central concept of woman, is very, very crucial, and there is great care not to move into gender as a more flexible category, and you saw that actually when we ask those questions, whereas actually when you see the work that is coming out in the European context and in the American context, there are attempts to move in more in the post-structuralist in the post-structuralist direction. What I can say is that when the debates came at Duke, when Gerda was presenting her work on that at Duke, the response by the audience was not great. And Claudia Kunz attempted to do precisely what Vera is doing nowadays, and precisely what our speaker was doing, the Indian speaker was doing, was telling the faculty, hey, then let us all try and think together what the history of patriarchalism can do for us here, now, a day. Let us, don't actually poo-poo that. Let us try and think what there is for us nowadays here with patriarchalism. They were not very keen. They were not interested any longer in patriarchalism. What's patriarchalism to them? There is a lot for it for the people in India. They, to the extent that they were interested in Western feminism, this did not mean for them. They were interested in masculinity. They were interested in performance. They were no longer interested in those questions. And then again, I'm talking about 1990s at Duke. You need a Vera to come and actually tell them, no, you're wrong. Try and work with it. Okay. how does this work actually in the biography here that we found out? What we found out here is about the way in which in Gerda Lerner's own biography, what calls her attention to the intersectionality of the woman's question is the Jewish question. In the 1970s, she becomes aware of the way of her own through the anti-Semitism in the 1990s, which calls her attentions to the fact, actually, to the fact that she needs to split the categories. His own experience as a Jew, and there, I mean, the intersectionality begins. What the problem is, though, then, as was exposed by Vera and in our discussion yesterday, then what is the relationship then between her Jewish history and her women's history and her woman's history? And what it looks like at this point is that the woman history, though, came out, not only was invested with the anxieties of the Jew and of the survivor, but may have as well come almost as a substitute for it. Moreover, that the narratives that have been proposed, and I'm finishing, that the narratives that have been proposed as for women history were no longer relevant, were no longer valid after the confrontation with the Holocaust in the 1990s became crucial to her, because she was then describing history as a story of a pogrom after pogrom after pogrom, and you cannot tell women's history in this manner. Christina Green provided us yesterday with a substitute for that when she was describing the story of after a fire, you look at the grass and you begin to see the beginning of a grass, and that gives you hope, and you continue, which is a secular alternative or a secular way of speaking about how you begin rewriting the history. Which gets me back to my final comment about what Gabriela was saying today. Okay, Gerda made the right decision throughout her life. Very few small mistakes, but she made the right decision all of her life. I was worried we will end all of the conference while discussing those issues relating to the method of women's history without realizing the larger context in which we are operating right now, and which is the way in which the rise of contemporary fascism constitutes, of course, the danger to women, but at this point is a universal danger. That is the way in which the primacy of the universal danger, which is rooted in a concept that you may want to call is the concept of race, right? And of cleansing of the entire population, is the major danger. So I was so pleased that it was finally brought out, and it's not a surprise that it was brought in Europe, right here, where the danger is still alive. So the question is, what do we do right now with everything that we have just said, with what does women history do right now in order to respond to this type of challenge? If the challenge is not answered with questions related to intersectionality versus women history versus intersectionality, if this is not the relevant question, but the relevant question is the question of national identity or the question of race, what is then the question that we can do right now? What would Gerda Lerner do today in terms of the politics of allyship or of building alliance in response to the current situation?
Yeah, thank you, Malaria. I think we have a next round to deepen some aspect. Thank you for opening up also fields of tension, but also that we need to think about our categories of analysis, also in a context-sensitive way. So I would like to ask you, Katharina, to finish our first round on the podium. As a postdoc scholar, you present in some way a next generation. So I think we will not hear personal or biographical memories, but more how Gerda Lerner's texts, ideas about, the autobiography speaks to you. So please.
So, thank you, Vera, for inviting me to this roundtable. I think we're running out of time a little bit, so I really try to keep it short. So we have the possibility for our audience to skip in. I was actually intending to talk about my personal experience because you shared all these emotional memories today, and I really liked it. Of course, I don't have that. I didn't know Gerda. But my personal experience or my personal story was linked to the university. I was a student of Helga Embacher, and it wasn't very common at Austrian universities, I think it still isn't today, to read whole books in history courses. But Helga forced us to read Fireweed, and I really loved it, and it changed my thinking. I guess I wasn't really feminist up to that point. On the one hand, it was because of my favorite history topic was actually National Socialism, so I connected on a scientific level. On the other hand, I was really moved by her story and being a woman and being a historian writing this kind of book. So honestly, I was thinking I want to write that kind of book, but and it was a stepping stone towards my journey to gender-sensitive research, I'd say. And I read some of her texts, not all of it, of course, but I interpreted it as women's history, and it fit in really well with my studies. But then it was when I took up my post as a PhD student and was allowed to teach myself in gender history courses and gender study courses that I was made aware of the differences and difficulties between gender history and women's history, and was forced to think about this topic, let's say. And it came kind of an issue for me as to what extent I could use these texts in the courses, in teaching, and to what extent they needed to be criticized and they needed to be re-examined, because I really needed the students to reflect that gender isn't synonym with women or woman, and they usually think that gender history is women's history. So I really tried to discuss it with them. So I was struggling, how do I use Gerda Lerner's texts, being women's historical texts on the one hand, and on the other hand, expecting them to think in much more complex categories, such as intersectionality, as we heard today, and something like that. I still completely agree with Gerda Lerner that women have been excluded from recorded history, and I think that some of these discussions overshadow this sometimes. So we quite only think about the differences and difficulties between women's history and gender history, but it is still a very important discussion and very important topic for me. And maybe just shortly, as you mentioned, my generation, I cannot speak, of course, for my generation of historians, but I was reflecting or thinking about it, and maybe it is the difference being shaped by these pioneering works of women's and feminist historians such as Gerda Lerner, while also being educated in a scholarly environment where gender history, intersectionality, post-perspective, so post-colonialism, post-structuralism already was integrated in my historical scholarship. So it's maybe a little bit different for me than those who were part of these efforts to institutionalize women's history. So, but I leave it with that, and we can take up a few points maybe. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katharina, also for bringing up this topic of generation, which is in fact something that we learned about also today. Yeah. So I think we should now open the floor for responding to each other, if you would like, but also to deepen some aspects with you in the audience. We have 20 minutes left, but also maybe Vera, you want to come in with some aspects. So at the first point, maybe we could, deepen some aspects or respond to each other. We discussed in advance some topics that could be interesting. First, the topic of institutionalization, for instance, which is relevant today when we see in Germany how women's and gender history professorships are under pressure, are not prolonged in a way. I think in Austria we are a little bit delayed concerning these aspects, but there is a danger that this is also something that swaps over to Austria. But thinking about how it is important to inscribe approaches that dealing with marginalized histories, voices into the university context, but also deepen this aspect that we discussed in the last statement, where we have to keep in mind the idea of we women and at the same time reflect on the challenges of queer, of post-colonial perspectives, of decentering positions of historical subjects in a way on multiple situative identities. But another aspect could also be thinking about, a topic that was addressed also today, the master narratives. So how do we have to reformulate and integrate marginalized voices? Where do we need close-ups and long shots, as Lynn Hunt states it? Yeah, but these are just some suggestions. Who wants to come in the conversation? Do you want to respond to each other? To the first? Maybe. Do you have some?
Maybe Bettina, do you want to respond to that?
Well, yes, I'm kind of bursting here with various ideas. I wanted to share a story with you because I think it's very relevant to this discussion about gender and women's history. I maybe, look, I'm an older generation. We fought for women's history really hard. And we fought for women's studies, what we called women's studies, but women's history, because women as a category, women because of the historic oppression of women, that's why. And I experienced the introduction of gender as an effort to dilute in some way that focus on women in all our diversity, in all our different class positions and racial positions and so on, which can be taught. And I'm not trying to force anybody into any kind of categories, but I wanted to share this story, and it'll be very short. I taught this class called Feminism and Social Justice online. And well over 130,000 people have taken this course, which is just phenomenal to me. I didn't know online stuff could be like that. A young woman from Iran, from Tehran, emailed me, and I began to talk with her. And she wanted, she considered herself a feminist. This is about 2 years ago. I don't even know if she's still alive. And I asked her how old she was. She was 15 years old. She was in high school, and she had taken this class on feminism and social justice. And she wanted to do a podcast in Tehran or in Iran on women's history. So I thought it might be very dangerous And I asked her to ask her mother if her mother had any advice about what we might do. And I suggested that we could do a podcast on US women's history, because I thought that might mediate it a little bit. Her mother thought that was a very good idea. And what were the books? So I had to send her books. We had to do a little seminar together. I sent her Gerda Lerner. And especially The Majority Finds Its Past, and a number of other essays, a few works of hers. And we did the podcast together. And it was an extraordinary experience. Now, for her, this wasn't an issue about gender. It was an issue about women, about women's history, and about the oppression of women within Iran, which is why she wanted to do a podcast on women's history. Now, this may be relevant to the sisters earlier that I didn't hear because I was trying to get a little sleep, but from India also. I've corresponded a lot with women in India, very similar kinds of situation. So that may be part of what's happening here, is that there is an intense oppression of women going on, including in the United States, including in the United States Supreme Court, for example, in removing our rights to reproductive justice. That's about women. And maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I just wanted to throw that out there and share that story with you from this very courageous young woman whose name was Diana Maz, M-A-Z, in Tehran.
Yeah,
Could I jump in? Would you the other voice from the other side of the Atlantic, Bettina, yeah, your comments about this courageous young woman's podcast reminded me that Gerda Lerner had a radio show in the early 1960s about great women in history that ran on public radio in New York City, which we just think is amazing, and more evidence of how Lerner understood that women's historians had to look inward and outward at the same time, right? Look at their own lives, look at the broader context, look at reforming the academy while also reaching out to the public. And we see in Lerner's archive this constant effort to do that. I mean, it's a huge task, and we're just struck by her energy and the capaciousness of her vision and her mentoring. I was really struck by Gabriella's comment about how Lerner really understood the forces that have tried to divide societies into us versus them. And Lerner focused on the them in all of these different contexts and the forces that have subordinated them. And just in terms of contemporary pressures, we haven't talked yet in this panel about the pressures of censorship and self-censorship, which I think are really bearing down on us in the US context. And it's not a coincidence that women's and gender studies is under special attack right now in the US Academy, right? If it's a way of analyzing power and a way of understanding, as Lerner put it, right, how society is divided into us versus them, and how them, the folks who are othered and ostracized, have rights and dignity, but also have power to shape history. I think it's not a surprise that women's and gender studies is it's horrific, and we need to fight back. But women's and gender studies, I think, is especially threatening to those who would like to maintain patriarchal structures of power in how we understand the past and how we exist in the present.
Yeah, thank you so much. Katharina, scharf.
Very short. I wanted to add to Bettina a similar experience, because I'm sometimes teaching at Volkshochschule, I don't know, public education,
Yeah.
and courses on women's movement and women's history. And it is really, for me, quite a different experience. It feels like much more like activism, and it is amazing talking with these women, and it really feels great. And I go out and think, oh my God, this was really great. But it is a really different situation at the university. I don't know, maybe it's just me, and maybe it's my kind of teaching, I don't know, but it feels quite different to talk to students at the university and discuss with them gender history and the term gender and something like that, and so that don't use gender and women as synonyms. But yeah, that's two different kind of worlds, maybe, I think. I don't know, but for me, I don't know how to combine it or how to bring it together, but I just wanted to share that experience that I feel it is very important, especially concerning public history narratives and something like that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we addressed also now the costs, the benefits from shifting concepts. Also, how it is important that we think about in which public we are discussing women's and gender history, and thinking about different publics where we need to address this topic, but also that I think you, Catherine, mentioned this that we always discuss as political subjects and as scholars, and how do we deal with these different roles in a way. So are there any comments, questions? Yeah, do you want to bring her in, VIENNA? Yeah, I think this would be nice.
I would just, hello, Stephanie.
Yeah, hi.
Do you want to say hello?
Yeah, I do want to say a few things.
Okay, because you almost finished with the whole thing, and now you
Yeah, I'm sorry. With the time change and late notification, I missed a lot. I wish I had seen it all. This has been the short time I've been able to tune in. Has been a profound and wonderful experience for me. I want to first respond to what Bettina just said, because I remember my mother being devastated when Wisconsin changed from women's studies to gender. She said something to me like, "This is the end. This is like what's going on here? You know, we've been out of history forever, and now we have to talk about whoever comes under the umbrella." Is there a time limit? I mean, you have an end to this, so I need to know what to say, what not to say. Vera?
I think you go ahead. Go
Just
ahead. Whoever has to go leaves, you know?
You know, I'm struck by many things personally as I listen to the little bit I've listened to, how Austria and Gerda's my mother's Jewish background was so much a part of who she became. And you have to know I was, you know, 8 to 12 years old when she wrote No Farewell, which is the book she wrote in German and then translated to English as her English was getting better. And, you know, I only have realized now that I'm in my 80s how big the trauma of her personal life impacted the directions she took unconsciously and consciously. And now, an aside, it's not really logical what I'm saying, but I'm also very beholden to the traditional Austrian system of education, which gave her all these skills, which I don't think the university offers anymore. I mean, I went to the University of Chicago because I saw what my mother had, the great book school. And I think that part of her attention was always to education and critical thinking, and how important it is, no matter what the discipline is of you scholars, is to somehow find a way with the challenging environment of AI to continue to provoke critical, independent thinking. And then in response to, I'm sorry, I don't remember his name, but the Israeli participant, what would her answer be now?
He's not Israeli.
I'm so sorry. What would she contribute now to this? Would be, has she lived? I mean, she turned her activism to the present moment constantly, where we lived, how we lived. I mean, we moved when I was young into an African American neighborhood in order to integrate it and to have that experience. And from that, she wrote a book called To Start a Stone, which was never published. She was always looking for, this is America, this is the problem that comes forward here because this is, pre-civil rights activism. This has to be solved. We have to go plunk ourselves down in the middle of it and do something. And the other image that comes up as part of her answer, which is fireweed. Fireweed is a symbol of the cycle of history is long. There's lots of repeats. We need to believe and work from hard work, clear thinking, clear communication, and hope. We need to believe that the essential human people that we all are, that we're good, we're empathetic, we can't erase our sense of simple right and wrong. She'd be angry about now, but I don't think she'd be overwhelmed. And I'm guessing she would stay in her bandwidth, which would be women's issues, but now I'm going a little bit aside again. She also very much encompassed in this, having grandchildren, my brother's children, the importance of including men in the education about women. And I mean, now that I have adult children, I mean, I can see that it's happening. They're both cognizant of this thing, for example, called menopause. What is that? That it really is something that impacts both their partners or their girlfriends and them. So there have been big changes in knowledge sharing about a woman's experience. And if you have any other things to ask me, I'm open.
Yeah, thank you so much for this contribution. I think this is a wonderful closing for our roundtable discussion. Thank you, all the discussants, and I'd like to hand over to Vera for the wrap-up of the conference. Thank you.
Okay. So this was quite a surprise. Yeah, but I am glad. So this is yeah, it came, everything came came full circle, so to speak. I'm not going to say a lot of things. I was going to say that I was not so sure during all of this, the whole symposium, of this hybrid format was such a good idea. But now at the end, I'm very glad that we did it, because otherwise you guys would not have been able to contribute to this whole thing, and yeah, and that was very, very valuable and also moving to me, to be honest. Yeah, so I'm not going to say a lot of things. I think one of the most important results is that Gerda Lerner's work brings people together who otherwise would not talk to each other. And yeah, with all the pros and cons that this has as a result. It also shows how many facets her work had, and how different it was received over time in different contexts. So that is what we call the simultaneity of asynchronicities. And that is something that came out to me pretty clear. It became pretty clear that Gerda Lerner's work inspired many ways of reading against the grain, or different types of close reading. And yeah, and obviously for many of us, the most important books are still The Creation of Patriarchy, Fireweed, and Black Women in White America. And I think after today's discussion, I think I want to go back to No Farewell. And I would encourage you to reread, maybe, or read if you have not yet read it, A Death of One's Own, because that's also a very important book. And in terms of all the challenges that we face, I don't know. We might be, to quote from Gerda Lerner's Feuerweed, in the eyes of the storm already. So I don't think we can call this backlash anymore. I think that's a little bit more what we face right now. So both in terms of, you know, scholarship and the state of the world, and speaking of male violence, I don't think that we have had a period where recently where rape, male violence, sexualized violence, child abuse was so normalized than it is currently. So maybe one of my ideas is maybe it calls for some sort of neo-lacrimose women's and gender history. Maybe that's would be something we could think about. Yeah, that is, other than that, the next conference could be what is transformational feminism, because that's clearly the concept that Gerda developed in her last years. So that was her vision. So the answer to your question, Malika, yes, feminism would have been the answer for Gerda Lerner. Okay, thank you so much for coming.